Today in the Catholic Mass series, we continue our consideration of art by focusing on the church itself and examining church architecture. Some argue that churches are just buildings like any other, but we'll see how the design of a church affects worship, influences the experience of the faithful, and even reflects theological principles. At the same time, sacred architecture is a human achievement, reflecting the spirituality of each age. So what's the history of church buildings? Where did they start? Is one type better than the other? And are all modern churches, modernist? On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation. This will make sure more people can find these episodes and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Now let's join Andrew Latham for episode 30, Church Architecture, Building the Terrible Place. Well, for this episode of the Catholic Mass series, we have the joy of welcoming on the show Mr. Andrew Latham, our special guest. Andrew, it's a joy for me because obviously you've been grilling me with questions for years now. And now I get the opportunity to return the favor.
Sweet revenge. I'm terrified. I just realized what this means.
Well, we'll see what happens on this really fascinating topic of church architecture. We have a really ambitious program today. Maybe we can just start off with you just explaining what the connection is between church architecture and the Mass, so we can connect it with this series.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, church architecture matters, well, for a few reasons. First, there's the practical considerations of where are you going to have Mass. Obviously, Mass can be said anywhere, and we're going to see that throughout history. But you go on a pilgrimage, or you go on a journey with a priest, up to the Cabrini Shrine outside of Denver. You've probably said Mass outside on the way up there, or something like that. Yeah. So obviously, Mass can be said anywhere. But there's always been this drive, this passion to make something that is fitting for worship. So there's that practical consideration. There's also the human connection where we have wanted, as humans, we want to innovate and build and do things that are beautiful. And throughout these 2,000 years, we've reflected that in the church buildings. Whenever we've developed something, some new way of doing something, we've first used it for the glory and honor of God. And you're going to see this throughout all the medieval and beautiful cathedrals. And then theologically, there's a theological connection, which obviously you can speak about much more than I can, Father, which is, a church is supposed to be a place where the divine and the human there's this bridge, or there's this connection, and it's supposed to reflect that. It's supposed to reflect the theological reality that Christ is present on the altar. And so there's going to be all the symbolism throughout time of meeting heaven on earth and entering into this sacred place, or as the introit for the consecration of a church says, this terrible place, in a good way, right? Terrible, terribilis locus est, I think.
Yes.
It is. And so there's always been this sense that we need to set aside something and make it beautiful and make it really perfect as we can here on earth. Yeah.
Yeah. I've it was earlier this year, I think, that, or maybe less than 6 months ago, I was on a plane with someone. It was this woman was a Mormon, and she was really saying how stunned she was by church architecture, by Catholic churches. And you can tell me, it's my impression that Catholic churches are really the greatest buildings in the world. That the world has not seen buildings such as Catholics have built for their churches. Basically, what I told her was that the reason why these buildings are so different from all other buildings in the world is because we believe in the real presence. Is because we believe that God is actually there. I mean, would you agree that that's kind of what sets these buildings apart from all others?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when we are able at first to start building them for that express purpose. And we're going to see that as we go through the history, and we're going to see how as our theology becomes more deep after the Council of Trent, that's going to inform the architecture as well. We're going to see it with the Second Vatican Council. We're going to see how that changes church architecture as well. I mean, we kind of know it just from our experiences, those of us who have been in and out of the Novus Ordo, but yeah, there's going to be this real sense that we have to create because our creator is there. And that's something that's really going to be beautiful. There's this great quote that I'd love to borrow from, and it's on this website that I didn't know about until recently, The Beautiful Home. And it sounds like a home decorating blog, but there's this fantastic article that goes through a lot of this history that we're going to be talking about today.
Right.
And there's this really poetic, there's a helicopter going nearby, Children's Hospital right nearby. But there's this beautiful quote, and the author, I don't know who it is. It's not, there's no byline, but he says, as in you, as in me, there's a pattern in our bones, a memory of what we are before we are, as so it is in the bones of the church, the basilica, and cathedral. A chain from conception through generations, the influence of time and place. Judaic, Greek, Roman, Syriac are each woven into our fabric, the flesh around the bones of God's house, blending ordered variation, a gradual development neither surprising nor shocking. Logic and use awaken each thing to maturity, the slow growth into an increasing complexity, even to the senility of the progressive, meaning the modern architecture, a species of corruption that ends in death. Here below, and so this is the introduction to this article, here below a brief recital of the house of God from its homey genesis until a fulfillment this past week, the glorious consecration of Immaculata Church in Kansas. And so they were writing this, talking about how, the Immaculata in St. Mary's, the SSPX chapel, the largest one in America, has kind of reached its, modern church architecture has kind of reached its zenith there, according to these guys. And I would tend to agree. But I love that idea that all of these forces, all of these influences are coming together and making a church.
Yeah, so, it's a nice quote, and since it expresses the Immaculata as a kind of a culmination, you have all that history behind it, and you got in 2023 this beautiful church. Yeah. So as far as the history of our church architecture goes, where do we start?
Well, from before Christendom, actually. And we're going to see how the foundations of church architecture begin in Roman times, begin in pagan Roman times. And so I mentioned this place that we have up on the screen, Dura Europos, the two-dimensional art that's on the inside. But this is the first church that we know of that is still in at least somewhat of existence. And this is in modern-day Syria. And this is, again, I mentioned this a little bit last week, so it might be a little bit of repetition here, but this was a home. This was a home that was used, and a couple of rooms of it were set aside for use as a church. So we have a baptistry. So one room was set aside here, and then another room was set aside for the sacrifice itself. And this was pretty much the standard, especially during times of persecution, where people would just gather in their homes. And so, I mean, Father, you know this from traveling around and doing missions, sometimes in the most unaustere or the most austere places, sometimes in homes of other people. And even today in persecuted places like in China, we have churches as homes, people gathering in homes because they can't do it otherwise. So the foundation of the church is actually in the home. And there's actually this beautiful kind of analogy there of, the church of the family, right? The family church has that connection there. But really quickly, in about 313, and when the Edict of Milan is signed, we have this rapid shift from underground worship to now Christians are allowed to build churches. And what do? There's no blueprint. Christ didn't tell us, hey, here's how to build a church. The apostles didn't really tell us how to do it. So we were pretty resourceful people, the early Christians, and we just reused what was already there. And these are these buildings that are called basilicas. There was a need for larger spaces to accommodate growing congregations. We couldn't just do it in houses anymore. And so Constantine, who is the one who signed the Edict of Milan, gave permission and actually gave some of these properties to the Catholic Church to be able to be used for gathering places. And he gave these basilicas. We have St. Peter's that was given in 333, St. Paul outside the walls, 324, St. John Lateran also in 324, St. Mary Major a little bit later, that's 432 AD. So in a span of about 100 years, we have all of these existing buildings being converted into churches. And what are these buildings? They are basilicas. That's where we get the name for them today. And a basilica, what is that? Well, it's part of a forum. In every town, we're used to we know the famous Roman forum, right? Friends, Romans, countrymen, that was in that place. But every town had its own forum. And this was essentially a marketplace. This is where people would gather. And to the side there, you can see up at the top, that building, that was the basilica. It was basically the law court. It was the civic center. It was the seat of government for the local place, and that was called the basilica. And this is where we get these church terms for basilica. It's from this building. So it would open up onto the market. In this slide, you can see the market off to the right side there, and there would be these open stalls. But at the very end, at the very front of the basilica, is what was called the apse, and this is where the governor would sit, or the magistrate, or whoever would sit, and he would be seated in power, and he would legislate and be judicial and all that kind of stuff. And so this is where we get the term basilica. It's from this Roman design and this Roman term. That's where we get the term basilica that's still used today. So St. Mary's Basilica here in Phoenix, the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception there in Denver. There are 93 basilicas in the United States, and there's hundreds, thousands more throughout the world. And a basilica is not just any church. We use that term today in ecclesiastical terminology to reference a church that has been given special permissions or special designation by the Holy Father. So he's the only one who can make a church into a basilica. So that's essentially what it is. But a lot of the churches that we're going to see throughout history are going to follow this same exact plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I've got a couple of questions on that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is it true that the Greek word basileos is that like mean like the house of the emperor, or the emperor? Is it have some reference to like the royal position?
Yes. Yep. And that's where they would be getting that term from. So it would be, it's a building that's set aside for the again, the person of power to be seated and to render judgment or to render legislative decisions. And so there's, again, this neat parallel between, the kingly place in the Greek terminology to a house of God in the Christian sense.
Yeah. So it's kind of the obvious place to have a church would be like the place of where he who holds power sits.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other question I had was in my home state of Kentucky, I encountered this group of Protestants who, they read the Acts of the Apostles, and the Acts of the Apostles, it talks about how the early Christians would meet in the houses of the believers. And this group of Protestants, they believed that, well, that's what you need to do in order to be followers of Christ. You have to sort of meet in houses. And you're making the argument that the only reason, from what I'm understanding, is that the early Christians were not able to build their own churches, but it wasn't like a theological statement on their part. Is there something in the historical record that really would help us back that up?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see people not just meeting in houses, but there's going to be this impulse immediately. I don't know exactly when the shift would be, other than the Edict of Milan, but there's going to be, from the time of again, that prohibition being lifted, that there's going to be a real thrust towards trying to make this place better. The other thing I would say, though, Father, is even when people were meeting in houses, they weren't just meeting in their living room. And we know this from the archaeological record of a place like Dura Europos. They are going to set aside individual rooms for worship. And the owners of the house wouldn't even go into those places. And again, we know this because we don't see any beans or, any sort of cooking utensils or anything in those rooms. All we're seeing is things set aside for sacred liturgy. So it's a bit of a stretch to say that you have to meet in a utilitarian room in order to follow the apostles, because from early on, we were setting aside rooms for worship. And so it's, again, not a stretch to say, well, let's set aside a place, a building for worship. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
No, it does. No, that's great. I mean, because it looked like a house, but it was functioning as exclusive space for worship, and therefore was not technically a house.
Right.
And then when I think of basilicas, I think of those Roman churches. Those Roman basilicas were donated by Constantine, and it kind of has that government building type look before the church developed its own style. But am I understanding what you're saying is that now we've taken that term and it doesn't really apply to us architectural style as much as a certain sort of level of church of a privileged church, because I think of that architectural style of the basilica is in Rome, but I guess there's many other basilicas around the world that just don't look like those.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, you go to downtown Phoenix, and the church here was built by the Franciscans, missionary Franciscans in the mid 1800s, and it does not look like this at all. It looks like, actually, it's Gothic revival, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So a basilica in our current terminology today has nothing to do with the style. But there is a Roman basilica. It gets confusing, but mainly when we're talking about, Immaculate Conception Basilica in Denver, it may not necessarily have that style.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. So when Catholics were actually had their freedom from Constantine, they weren't persecuted, and they started to think about building their own churches. What did they do? What were the first churches that they actually built on their own?
So they're going to follow the same style. It's kind of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're going to look at this is a rendering of the old St. Peter's, the original St. Peter's Basilica, which was built by Constantine himself in the 4th century. And a lot of them are going to be built with this sort of structure because, again, it just makes sense. It's functional. The Roman church especially has always been the sense that it's functional, it works, let's use it, and let's make it beautiful, and let's make it as perfect as possible. So this is what's going to be happening in the West. But at the same time, we're going to see that there's going to be a shift when we go to kind of the new Roman Empire, which is going to shift to Byzantium. So that's going to open the door to Byzantine influence. And there's going to be a real distinct shift from the Roman basilica model to kind of their own model. They're going to be moving away from these long rectangular basilicas towards centralized and domed structures. This is a depiction of the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which was built just shortly after, about a couple hundred years after the old St. Peter's. This was commissioned by Emperor Justinian, who was the Roman emperor at the time. And there's a whole long story about why that was built, and he did it more for political purposes, but we don't need to get into that right now. But this is going to become kind of the blueprint for the Eastern Church, for the Byzantine style. What it's doing is he's combining this longitudinal basilica and a centralized building in this totally original manner. So you're going to see these, it's more square than anything, and it's going to be more centralized. Most of the churches that are going to be built in the East are going to be of a Greek cross pattern, or more of a square, more of a round pattern. They're not going to be as long and rectangular. And it's going to be topped with this huge dome. It's a 105-foot main dome, and it's going to be supported by this architectural innovation called a pendentive, which is basically a way of transforming a square supports, right? Those 4 supports down there, into a circle, and that triangular support system. And that's going to allow the Hagia Sophia to be built with basically domes stacked on top of domes and achieve this incredible effect. It's going to be, and the structure we have today is still standing. It's been there for a really, really long time. What does the interior look like? So that's basically the floor plan. The interior is going to be covered with gold mosaics, with these floating, almost mystical looking lights from these windows that are up in what's called the clerestory. So these upper windows that are going to let light in. And they would say that the dome is going to be this vision of heaven descending down into earth. So you can see all those little windows up at the top, and there's going to be these windows that are going to be filtering light down below. And it's really going to be this beautiful, rich, again, this connection between heaven and earth. Yeah.
That's so sad to see those Muslim symbols on in the Hagia Sophia.
It really
such
is.
A beautiful architecture and church that's in the Catholic spirit, but has now been taken over by Muslims.
Yeah, and this has been a contentious building, a contentious church over the years. Just some brief history. So it was built in the 500s. In 1204, we have Latin crusaders, so from the west, coming in and attacking, and they actually desecrated the cathedral. Whole long story there about why they did that, but east and west not getting along at that time in the 1200s. They took some of the mosaics out and brought them over to Venice. We'll talk about Venice a little bit later. Then in 1453, we have the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. Then it's turned into a mosque. And what they're going to do is they're going to desecrate, they're going to take down all of the mosaics, and they're going to cover them all with whitewash, with plaster. Some of them are going to be able to be uncovered in 1847, a little bit later on, but essentially all of the mosaics are gone. Except, interestingly, Father, and I think you and I have talked about this a couple times, there is still this veneration by the Muslims, what I guess I would call correct me if I'm wrong, but there's respect that Muslims have for the Blessed Virgin, for Mary. Because again, they believe that Jesus was a prophet like Muhammad, and they venerate Mary. And so this was one of the only images in the Hagia Sophia that was untouched. They left the image of Mary. I've heard someone say that it will be through Mary that the Muslims will eventually convert. And I fully believe that because, there's maybe something there, whatever, that's a sidebar. But it's when we have this Ottoman invasion, we have these minarets, these 4 towers that are erected on the outside. A great chandelier was added, this mihrab, which is right in here. A mihrab is basically, instead of an altar, we have this prayer niche, which is facing towards Mecca. That's going to be added, and all sorts of other things, right? This kind of pulpit structure that Muslims would be using instead of you, Father. And again, all these prayers. All of the images are, again, whitewashed over. In good news, in 1934, this was transformed into a museum. So now Christians could go in and at least see it. But just recently in 2020, the president of Turkey converted the building back into a mosque. Now, Christians are still allowed to go into it. My brother was just there and visited, and he was able to go into it, but you can't go in during prayer services, et cetera. And it is still a mosque today. But that's kind of the very, very brief history of the Hagia Sophia. So again, those 4 minarets were added in over time, but it is a stunningly beautiful building, and it would have been just glorious to see it back then.
Yeah, and I mean, it's certainly a motive of prayer for us that one day, I mean, we would hope that either that the Muslims convert or the Catholics are able to repossess their own church.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this Byzantine architecture, is it just a thing of the East, or is there some influences that have been exercised on the West as well?
There's going to be a lot of influences that are going to come over to the West as well. And one of the things that is going to come over to the West is the style, the artwork, like I mentioned last week with the art podcast. A lot of these Byzantine artists are going to kind of migrate over, become pilgrims, because of the iconoclasm controversy that's going to be happening during the 700s and 800s. And so they're going to bring not just the 2-dimensional art and the mosaics, but they're going to bring the architecture as well. Since this is an audio podcast, also a video, and since we're talking about the Hagia Sophia, I do want to play about 2 minutes of audio, if that's all right, Father.
Sure.
It's obviously impossible to know for us today what the Hagia Sophia would have sounded like. We were talking about it would have been beautiful to go in there back in those days and see all the mosaics intact, et cetera. What would it have sounded like? And this was I heard this on the radio years ago. This was on NPR years ago, this little piece. And I came home and immediately saved it. And I was like, I got to save this and share this with my class. And I'm going to share just 2 little bits of it with you here today as well.
Okay.
This 13th century Byzantine chant is being sung by Capella Romana, a choir from Portland, Oregon. This is what they sound like in a studio. Now imagine, it's the early 13th century. You're sitting inside the Hagia Sophia. Marble pillars rise up around you. Dusty light filters into the windows in the massive dome above. And this is how you might hear Capella Romana. This transformation is possible because of 2 scholars at Stanford University in 2 very different fields.
So I cut out a little portion there, but essentially what they're doing is they're doing an audio mapping of the Hagia Sophia. They got permission to go in, and what they did is they popped a balloon And with a bunch of microphones all around, they were able to create an audio map of what the Hagia Sophia sounded like. And then they can apply that filter to Byzantine chants and be able to hear what it would have sounded like.
Oh, that's just amazing.
It's great.
It's just like the sound just goes up and just kind of gets lost in heaven. You know, the church is so vast that the sound has so much space to expand in. It's almost like it floats all the way up to heaven.
Exactly. And so when you hear some of these chants, you know, imagine Gregorian chant, imagine any sort of the chants that we have, you know, you hear it on in a studio, and it just, it's very nice, but it wasn't meant for that. It was meant for buildings like this, and acoustics are going to be a huge part of how they're going to design churches as well. And here's just the last little bit of this section here.
And is captured at Basilicas head.
Remember that balloon pop? Here is what Pancheva recorded inside the Hagia Sophia.
Wow.
Abel used the acoustic information in the balloon pops to create a digital filter that can make anything sound like it's inside the Hagia Sophia.
This process is called convolution, and it is a mechanism by which the acoustics of Hagia Sophia can be imprinted on any sound we desire.
And it's only really been possible for the last 10 years or so because of advancements in our understanding of how sound works in a space. So, imagine, it's the early 13th century. You're sitting inside the Hagia Sophia. Marble pillars rise up around you, and dusty light filters in through the windows in the massive dome above.
It's actually something that is beyond humanity that the sound is trying to communicate.
Capella Romana recently released an entire album with this filter called The Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia.
It's on Spotify, it's on Apple Music, it's on YouTube. You can find it wherever. So it's
nice.
It's astounding to listen to.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was in the Holy Land, and like I went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre like at 5 a.m. or something, and there was this Armenian monk singing. And it was the same sort of effect. His voice was just like going throughout the whole space. Wow. You know, I was kneeling there praying next to the spot where our Lord was crucified. Wow. Yeah, really incredible.
That is.
So
that's
anyway,
amazing.
Yeah, that was a worthy tangent there.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay, so Byzantine design, it's going to come over to the West, and the key characteristics, it's going to be, like I said, Greek cross floor plans. We're going to have a lot of domes on top of pendentives. We're going to have a lot of mosaics, and we're going to have a lot more focus on divine mystery. Instead of just the basilica being a place for worship, they're going to try to create a space that encapsulates that is theologically sound as well. And there's a lot more details that we can get into, but essentially they're going to be trying to make sure that, and it's odd for us, Latin Catholics, Western Catholics, because again, we're used to this very long rectangular space, but it's not so much that way. You're going to see a lot of Byzantine style churches that are going to be circular or kind of squarish looking. It is odd, but that's going to be their main focus. Like I said, they're going to come over, and a lot of that influence is going to be to the west. This is the plan of the church in Ravenna, the Basilica of San Vitale. This was built in about the 500s. And it's an octagonal plan. It's a domed interior, beautiful mosaics on the inside. Every part of the church is going to be covered with mosaics. Some of them have not survived over the centuries. That's why you can see some of the plain spaces there. But areas that don't have these mosaics are covered with this beautiful marble as well. And there's stone carving as well. And you're going to have this kind of very unique pattern, unique way of doing these capitals on these pillars. They're not quite Corinthian. They're not quite Ionic or anything like that. They're their own little variation, their own little twist on a Corinthian column. And these are the tops of the columns in the Basilica of San Vitale. Speaking of the Immaculata, again, very similar. Again, not quite the same, but very, very similar. So again, there's a little bit of a connection there too. Ravenna is up here. So this is where the kind of the focus of Eastern architecture is in the 500s. As we move forward a little bit, we're going to have the influence of Eastern architecture move up here to Venice. And Venice is going to have a lot of influence from the east as well. They're right next to Greece. They're right next to, again, they're a huge trading port. And so they're going to have a lot of Eastern influence. And we're going to see that especially in the Basilica of San Marco. A lot of Byzantine influence there as well. These trade and connections, it's going to bring in architects, it's going to bring in artists, and the entire basilica is kind of going to be done in the same way. It's going to be a mini-me, a little copy of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople with 5 domes, and the floor plan is almost identical in a lot of ways. If you look, St. Mark's is very big, but it's essentially just a Greek cross. It's a little bit longer on the left side there, but it's equal arms, domes over each arm, and there's 5 domes representing the 5 wounds of Christ. And it's a very, again, direct link to the kind of architecture that we're going to see throughout Constantinople. Inside, we have, again, very similar, these small windows in the clerestory, bringing in light directly into the dome, and that gold is just going to shimmer and shine everywhere. Like you look anywhere in St. Mark's, and it's just this incredible shimmering effect.
Yeah. The dome, is there like an architectural or theological significance? What is the signification of the dome? Because sometimes you see the baldacchino and maybe a dome on top of it. I don't know if is there a theological signification there?
It's an easy way to reach high. It's a proven way to reach high. They're going to take architectural points from the Romans, at least in as far as I know. They're going to take architectural points from the Romans, and they're going to say, all right, well, we can build this structure, and this can be at the very top, and it's a way to reach up towards heaven. That's at least my understanding of it. There may be a deeper theological connection there, but it was seen as the way to reach as high as possible with this type of construction that they had at the time.
Okay, so like the dome resting on the 4 columns kind of solidifies it, it holds it down.
Yeah, and it's going to be easier to kind of hold everything together with that round structure, because it is so there's so much physics.
Right. Yeah.
Bottom line physics.
Yeah, totally.
All right. So as we move into Europe in the rest of the Romanesque style, what we would call today the Middle Ages, or what some would call the Dark Ages, those that aren't as much influenced by the Byzantine and are more kind of influenced by the Romans, which is why we call it Romanesque, because it's of the Roman style, you're going to see a few characteristics. Rounded arches. This is inspired by Roman engineering, right? Arches are just going to be easy to build, easy to construct, and we know that they're going to last for a long time. We're also going to see these arched windows. If you ever see arched windows with kind of a column in the middle, that's dead giveaway that's Romanesque, or at least Romanesque inspired. We're also going to have really thick columns and thick walls to support all that weight. We haven't yet figured out how to support the weight of these stone walls yet. And so we're going to be needing to have really thick walls to support all of that. If there is decoration, there's not very much. It's going to be at least on the outside. It's going to be carved in. There's going to be minimal decoration, because again, most of the exterior is going to be about providing support and providing, foundational support for the roof. Most of the roofs are going to be wood. There's going to be some that are clad in maybe some stone, but again, it's going to be really difficult to keep up the weight of all that stone just with walls like that. You can do it with arches, but again, it's going to be difficult. We're going to see kind of how they solve that here in a little bit. Also in the Romanesque, we have this kind of fortification style. And monasteries are going to be at the forefront of a lot of architecture. Monasteries are going to be the spiritual, the civic, and the religious center. And so they're not going to innovate so much with the churches. They're going to be pretty much the same as what we've already seen. But monasteries are going to be the kind of the center of culture and of society. What are the characteristics there? They're going to have high walls encircling it. They're going to also have what's often called the heart of a monastery, which is the cloister. And a cloister is essentially just a row of arches. And a row of arches, we call that an arcade. So anytime you have a row of arches, that's an arcade. And they're going to encircle this. It's going to be a little bit of a sense of peace and quiet in the kind of the hustle and bustle of the rest of the community, which always grew up around the monasteries. Access to the cloister was usually restricted, and that was a place where the monks could talk freely, depending on the rule, etc. Over time, they become more complex, more beautiful. This is more of a Gothic style. This one is more of an English Gothic style. But let's go back to the Romanesque. inside the monasteries, again, big chunky walls, lots of stone, very small windows, because again, the more you cut into that space, the less support you have for the roof. So we have the chapter house, we have the refectories, and that's going to be kind of how monasteries and most stone buildings are going to be built for about 500 years. There's not going to be a whole lot of innovation. One thing that I do want to note, because it's going to come back into play here in a little bit, is the Cistercians. They're going to have where some of the other, the Benedictines, not so much the Franciscans, but the Benedictines are going to have more decorative things, and they're going to be more well-to-do. The Cistercians are going to be much more severe, much more strict. And so their monasteries, their grounds are going to reflect this. The Cistercian architecture is very plain. There's not a lot of decoration. Even when you get to the interior of it, it's very plain, not a lot of decoration. Even modern Cistercian monasteries are still reflecting that same kind of vibe, I guess you'd call it, of doing away with anything that's extraneous, focusing the mind entirely on the spiritual, and getting rid of anything that's superfluous, unnecessary.
Yeah. So, I mean, are you saying that the Byzantine style really predates the Romanesque style, or was the Romanesque style something that came? You're dating it to starting with the 9th century. Were there Romanesque churches before then? Because I guess my simplified view is just like, okay, if you're learning architecture in the 4th century, 5th century, whatever, you're learning the Roman style, right? Mm-hmm. And you're thinking, well, I'm going to build a church. You would naturally use the Roman style when building the church. And that's why Romanesque, my impression was like one of the first styles of Catholic church architecture.
Yes. It's a bit contentious among the nerds in terms of when you start dating Romanesque. Some people will say 9th century. That's what I have in my notes, because that's when they started to develop things like groin vaults and these larger columns that are going to be supporting arcades, etc. But yes, the style is not going to change so much. So broadly speaking, Romanesque is happening right around the same time as Byzantine. So both are going to be happening around 580, one in the west, one in the east. There's going to be a little bit of a meeting of the minds a little bit later on, but essentially, the date is either 5th or 6th century or 10th century, depending on how you want to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so impressive to me. You go to Europe and you still find like the Roman aqueducts, like Segovia, this is incredible aqueduct. And we think of the Romans as great engineers, but so they were very practically minded, but at the same time, they weren't utilitarian, because I guess I'm saying it's a beautiful thing to look at, and they love those arches. Mm-hmm. So they incorporated utility and beauty, something that we don't do today.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Romans would take great pride in that. They would say, the whole Roman ethos with architecture was, we're going to take what the Greeks have done, because the Greeks came before them broadly. And they're going to say, we're going to add to it, add more beauty to it, and make it more perfect. And perfection in their eyes was not just utility. Perfection was trying to make it as beautiful as possible as well. And so they're going to take the time to make things what we would call today superfluous, but they're going to think that is absolutely important. And we would agree.
Yeah. And it's just like another one of those things from the pagan world, where Catholics weren't just like, let's just chuck this all out. This is horrible. Yeah. It belongs to the pagans. But no, they say, well, there's something naturally good here. Let's adopt this architectural style and make beautiful houses for God.
Uh-huh. Yeah, totally. They're going to see the value in the natural good. Absolutely. I mean, it's like Aquinas taking on Aristotle or building upon Aristotle. It's the same sort of thing there. One of the best examples that I'd like to show of Romanesque architecture, especially Norman Romanesque, which is northern France, is Durham Cathedral. This was constructed about 1133, and this is kind of the pinnacle, the high point of Romanesque architecture before we get into the Gothic. This was about as advanced as Romanesque architecture is going to get. They're going to have these really, really thick columns and these thick piers, very small windows, very thick walls. It is imposing. It's tall. It's grandiose, but it's heavy, right? There's this real sense of solidity to it. How are they going to be constructing it? Well, with basically arches. Arches work. They work really well. Let's not mess with it. What we're going to see is how the later Gothic architects are going to advance on that. But these are what we call a barrel vault. So basically any sort of a hallway, they're going to construct with what's called a barrel vault. And then they would also use a groin vault. So where the transept and the nave, so the crossing and the main section of the church are going to be joining, they're going to do a groin vault, and that's going to be help to be supported. In the east, they're going to try to build a dome on top of it, or successfully build a dome on top of it. It's not so much happening here in the west. Columns, they're purely utilitarian. If there is decoration in the columns, it's going to be very minimal. Sometimes they're going to add some twisting to it, but it's not going to be. These are going to be in cloisters where there's not going to be a lot of weight on top of it. But the main innovation that we're going to see in Durham Cathedral and in the high Romanesque is this innovation called piers. Basically, they're going to take a bunch of columns, put them all together like a bundle of reeds, and that's going to help support multiple arches, multiple roof structures at the same time. And this is going to be, again, we're going to see this when we look at Durham Cathedral. So in the middle there of that top image, that's a pier. On the left and the right, where we have the zigzag pattern, that chevron pattern, or those lozenges, those are just regular columns. And you can see how that pier structure is going to help the entire roof be supported. These are often hollow, filled with rubble in order, again, it's this constant battle that the Romanesque architects are going to face between lightness, as in weight, and structure and support. And they haven't quite figured out the formula yet.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I was hoping that you were going to say that St. Isidore's in Watkins, Colorado was a premier example of Romanesque architecture, but what can you do?
Oh, I'm sorry, Father. I was gonna say that was Romanesque revival, not Romanesque.
Okay.
No, but it is. It is a great example. But Durham is up there. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is pretty impressive. And yeah, when I think of the Romanesque, I just think of these, just like the massive weight of these structures and the darkness, like the tiny windows. And you go into the dark church. And I think of the old churches in Europe, when you go to these villages and you have the most ancient churches, there, it's going to be Romanesque, right?
Yeah.
And they're just going to be so blocky.
Yeah. And there's a real sense of calm and peace that's within those walls. You go in and you feel the coolness, because that stone has just insulated you and it's quiet. And there's a real sense of beauty in that as well. One of the things that is going to be also added during this time is what's called the ambulatory. So right here on this section, we would have the altar right about here. And then you would have the ambulatory. And what the ambulatory is this section. And pilgrims would be coming in to these places because, again, the Holy Land is going to be not accessible at this time. And so pilgrims want to pilgrim. So where are they going to go? They're going to go to wherever there's a relic or wherever there's a sacred space. And whatever relics there were or sacred items would be placed in these small, what we call today side chapels, but these little chapels that are going to be off to the side of this section. And so the pilgrims, even if there's a mass going on, right here in the middle, they're going to be able to come in without disturbing too many people, walk down this, and it's going to be called the ambulatory because people are going to be walking through it. But even still, these sections are going to be very, very dark and closed off, and we're going to see how that's going to be transformed when we get into the Gothic. That church plan that I was showing was St. Martin of Tours, and so this is the reliquary, the burial spot where St. Martin is kept. And so this is one of those little ambulatory chapels where even if mass is going on in the main altar, you can still go in and venerate his remains there.
Yeah, very nice.
So what is the symbolism? What's the purpose of Romanesque? Like we were talking about, it's meant to convey strength, stability, the permanence of faith. Interiors are kind of mysterious and dark. There's this awe. Eastern orientation of churches. We talked about that just, I think, very, very briefly. That's going to become much more common. That's always been a thing since the earliest days of Christianity of facing the east when you construct a church, at least for purpose-built church. But it's going to become much more the norm. It's never, and correct me if I'm wrong, Father, but it's never going to be a strict law of the church, but it's going to be strongly recommended that if you're going to be building a church, do your very best to make it face east for the symbolism of facing the risen Christ.
Yeah, that's right. It's not absolutely required. But I was surprised to see that the Eastern orientation was becoming more common with the Romanesque as opposed to it being just the normal thing. I mean, is that what you're saying? It wasn't really the norm up to that point?
It was the norm, if at all possible, but what this is going to be more of during this time period, they're going to be able to purpose build churches more specifically for that purpose, and they're going to be doing more civic planning. We're actually going to see this with St. Peter's Basilica, where, well, geography, et cetera, is going to be impacting how we can arrange the church. So we'll just build it, and it doesn't really matter. Whereas they're going to take a much more purposeful approach during the Romanesque period of we're going to build the entire town around this if we have to, but it's going to face east. So it's going to be much more of a priority during that point, I guess I would say.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then of course the next great architectural style is the Gothic style. I mean, it's one of my favorites, so I'm happy to hear you talk about the Gothic.
And the Gothic is just going to be this real innovation in a good way. So the biggest thing that's going to change the Gothic architecture is the rounded arch versus the pointed arch. And there's going to be a couple pretty important reasons why. An arch is stable, right? It's going to be based on a sphere, the pantheon, right? All that kind of stuff. But you still have a couple forces working against you. You have the force of gravity coming straight down, right? That keystone at the very top, there's weight and it's coming straight down. You also have forces of gravity pushing this way and pushing this way, right? All those stones that want to push out that way, which means you have lateral forces, and it's going to want to make the wall push out the side there as well. So those lateral forces are going to be fighting against you constantly, which is why they're going to need to build really monster thick walls and fill them in, right? Or add buttresses, which we'll see off to the side. What you can do with Gothic is if you simply point the arch, you're going to, instead of the force going out like this, you're going to have the force going more down in this direction. And it's going to be more easily supported by the smaller pillars. So you can do smaller pillars, smaller walls, and it's going to allow the force of gravity to work with you. You're basically working with gravity instead of against it. This seems like such a simple thing for us today, but it was such a huge innovation at the time. What is this going to do for us? It's going to allow arches to be able to be built that the smaller pillars are going to be able to support more weight, basically per capita, per pound of stone. And so you're going to have these ribbed vaults, what we're going to call ribbed vaults. These are thinner walls with columns, and you're going to see the force going straight up into these ribs. And these ribs are essentially going to be an extension of the column going straight up in there. So you don't have to have big blocky stones filling in the whole ceiling, and you don't have to worry about the weight of those. They're just going to be very thin, like we would call shingles today, or they're going to be very thin, almost like ceiling tiles. And you're going to be able to basically face the entire interior ceiling of the church with these lighter weight materials, because it doesn't need to be structurally sound. All the weight and all the structure is going to be on these ribs going up and down. Sorry, I got distracted. There was a truck going by. So again, that's the main innovation. That's going to be the main difference. You're going to be able to have walls that are thinner. You don't need to have, these buttresses, right? These supports along the side anymore. And all of the weight, instead of coming down at every possible place on every inch like this, instead you're going to have it all in one spot. And that's going to be, again, seems very simple to us, but it's going to be an incredible innovation.
Yeah, I just I think it's incredible the timing, because as you know, I'm in my book just trying to point out that really the scientific method was invented in the Middle Ages, and that's when they kind of corrected Aristotle's physics. Like Aristotle's physics was adopted for centuries upon centuries, and it was just incorrect. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's any like they had to know the physics. They had to work out like the like you were just diagramming for us, where the forces go in order to figure out with the, is it called the ogival arch? Is that what it's called?
Yep.
Yeah. With that ogival arch, that they were going to do a better distribution of the forces. They must have figured out the figures. Is there some textbook from the time about that, or some writings from the time about that?
There are some. Most of it is anecdotal. I was actually just explaining to my students about this the other day. The main way that the architect, and there wasn't architects back then, there were master masons. The main way that they would figure this out is on the floor of their own home, they would pour concrete, which again sounds normal to us today, but back then most homes didn't have a foundation of concrete. But they would pour a foundation of concrete, and then they would take a metal implement. So just like this, like my Apple Pencil here, but made out of metal. And then they would take metal compasses that the blacksmith makes them, and then metal straight edges, and they're just scratching in the floor. That's their paper, because paper's expensive and it gets ruined and it gets lost. And so they're going to be working this all out on a cement floor with metal implements. And when I hear that, I marvel all the more at the ingenuity of how these cathedrals have remained standing for 1,000 years, almost 1,000 years, when they're doing it with these, to our modern eyes, very, very crude implements. They didn't have AutoCAD. They didn't have calculators. They didn't have laser levels. It's really astounding to see.
Yeah, it is. It's extraordinary. And I think it kind of embodies the spirit of the Middle Ages. When you think about, this is their technology. They're using their technology for the glory of God. Today we use our technology, just like for utilitarian purposes or entertainment purposes or whatever. Yeah. But they're putting the whole force of their technology into building these incredible structures for God.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's going to be the life work of a whole community, several generations of work for a whole community to build one of these. And it's going to be, it's really astounding. It's really humbling to think about. One of the other innovations that they're going to come up with, again, we've been talking about buttresses, right? These supports that are going to be on the outside of walls, and they're going to keep them, but they're going to do what's called a flying buttress, right? It's just another kind of quarter arch that's going to be coming in to help support, because there is still going to be some of that outside force going this way. And so they're going to add, again, those flying buttresses to counteract that. And we're going to see that all throughout a lot of these Gothic churches. So flying buttresses. When you think of a Gothic church, this is probably the picture that you think of. These are the flying buttresses that are on Notre Dame Cathedral. So again, it's this light, airy feeling, and because of the arches being pointed, because of the weight going straight down instead of being laterally out, you're going to be able to build higher. You're going to be able to build a lot more light into it and thinner walls. So it's going to be cost effective as well. It's probably going to be offset by the cost of the windows, but regardless, it's going to be really, really beautiful. So these key features of Gothic churches, there's going to be a verticality. You can build taller. You were asking about domes. That was the way that they would reach to heaven. Now we can have spires, because now we figured out that we can have this kind of pointed structure, and it's going to be physically working. Chartres is a great example of this, just this explosion upwards. This is one of the early Gothic cathedrals. I took this picture back before they had finished the restoration. As a side note, you can see how dirty churches get over the course of about 800 years with all the soot and the dirt. And then they were power washing and cleaning and making it all beautiful and pristine again. But now the work has been completed and it's beautiful. But anyway, light-filled interiors. So you have more space for windows. Now you can have what are called rose windows, these beautiful circular windows filled with stained glass, because you don't have to have the support in there anymore. And then you can have incredible, what's called stone tracery, which is basically stone sculptural elements on top of pillars and on top of other elements, other architectural elements. Again, you can have those where you wouldn't dare to put any extra stone more than you needed on. Now you can plop on statues of saints, and you can do all kinds of other again, sculptural elements that you weren't going to be able to do before, always with the impetus to rise up, to go higher, to try to reach towards the heaven again, because this is this sacred split space between heaven and earth. So let's try to reach as high as we can.
Yeah, I mean, this is a totally different experience walking into the Gothic church versus the Romanesque. I mean, the Romanesque is like blocky, tight, heavy, and you feel it's dark and mysterious, and there's maybe a few candles flickering. But with the Gothic church, you're just kind of totally overwhelmed, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
You feel tiny in comparison with this mass, and all the light streaming in. It's kind of like entering into heaven.
It is. And this is, I have not been here to Cologne Cathedral. This is what we have on the screen. Have you been to Cologne, Father?
No.
Oh, I would love, this is on my bucket list. I'd love to go. But this is one of the tallest Gothic structures. I think it's second or third tallest. Amiens might be a little bit taller. I'm not sure, but anyway, this is again one of those incredibly high-reaching Gothic cathedrals that just kind of wants to reach towards heaven. Now, we've talked about the Eastern orientation a couple times. One thing that's going to develop is kind of the theology of architecture, or architecture as theology, depending on how you want to look at it. Let's go back to Chartres for a second real quick. On the left side of the screen, we have, this is going to be facing west, so the entrance of the church, and that's called the westwork. And as you're entering into the church, when you're entering in, oftentimes there would be depictions of Christ in glory. So as a creator or as the judge, oftentimes there's some sort of a depiction of Christ in glory. This is the kind of that three-tiered entrance that you have in Chartres Cathedral. Excuse me. And so that's, again, you're entering into the majesty of God. And so there's going to be that kind of theological connection. Again, this is not a hard and fast rule, but this becomes the norm during this time. On the north side, so it'll be on the left side as you're walking in, the gospel side, you're going to have depictions of the Old Testament. And so these are the sculptures that are on the Old Testament side, the north side of the church. And it's for the same reason, theologically, traditionally, symbolically, that the priest faces towards the north when he's preaching the gospel towards the darkness. And so the Old Testament hasn't received the redemption yet, hasn't received the revelation yet. And so we're going to have Old Testament figures on that side. And then on the south side, which is facing the sun. Again, we're talking about northern climates here. So if this were all being done in Australia, it would be totally backwards. But you have depictions of the New Testament. On Chartres here, we have a depiction of Mary being queened as heaven, as queen of heaven. And then depictions of these saints. This is Saint Anne and Saint Joachim, I believe. And then we have depictions of the martyrs and the saints. So again, there's a theology in stone that's really, really beautiful that's going to be developed during this time as well.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I could talk with you about Gothic forever, listen to you talk about Gothic forever. But we better move on to Baroque because we got so many centuries to cover. Yeah.
So let's go into Baroque. So Renaissance is going to be happening. Renaissance is going to be this big movement that's happening in Italy. Italy is not going to be following the Gothic very, very much. They're actually going to be kind of seeing it as uncouth. That's where we get the name Gothic, because they're going to say, well, it's like what the Goths were doing. And the name stuck. But in Italy during this time, during the Renaissance, we have, again, this very classical revival. It's this first revival of classical architecture. Bringing symmetry, proportion, simplicity. You're going to see round windows, but essentially everything is going to be very, very simple, except for the stone. They're going to do different colors of stone, but they're going to be using rounded arches, classical columns all throughout Italy. Now, the Renaissance is nothing if not full of hubris, right? It's all about man is wonderful, man is great, look at what man can create. And my favorite story of Renaissance pride is the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, or the Duomo in Florence, the main church in Florence. They built this basilica, they built this cathedral, and they anticipated that this was going to be the largest dome in the world and the widest one and the tallest one, except they had a problem, Father. They didn't know how to do it. And they said, well, let's just build this without the dome and we'll figure it out. So they started doing it, and there was a hole in the church for a long time. And if you want to know more about this, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. If you want to know more about this is a great book, Brunelleschi's Dome by an author named Ross King. I've got it in the notes. It reads like a novel. It reads like a story. It's all true, but it goes through kind of the process. A couple problems with this. It's octagonal, right? It's not circular. So you can't do it in the same way that you did it with the Pantheon, because now you have arches and circles and it's just confusing. Also, it's not a perfect octagon. All the sides are a little bit different in length. That's going to complicate things. So they bring in a guy named Brunelleschi. He's going to enter a contest. He's going to propose this design, and they're going to say, how are you going to do it? And he's essentially going to say, again, the hubris of the Renaissance, oh, I know exactly how to do it. Father, he didn't know. He didn't know how he was going to do it. he was figuring it out as he went. He had some ideas, and we think that he sort of knew what he was doing, but he never told anyone. And in one writing that we have found, he expresses doubt about whether or not he would actually be able to do this or not, but he wasn't going to let anyone know that. It actually took us years to figure out how he was able to do it. And it was an Italian student, college student, who kind of did some forensic study and figured it out. Basically, he used a system of ropes. So over here, he's using, instead of using a compass, he's using basically just a rope to figure out how to make the construction go up without killing people down below. And he's going to be using this pattern, this interlocking pattern of these herringbone style of these bricks. It's going to be self-supporting all the way up because there's no way that there's enough timber in Tuscany to support this thing. So it was completely self-supporting all the way up. Anyway, I could talk about this dome for a while. It's a great book. I would suggest you read it. But that's going to be, eventually it's going to be slightly smaller than the Pantheon in width, but it's going to be taller than any other dome in history. It's going to be this huge achievement.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, are you basically saying, if we go back that slide, like the bricks are resting upon one another, like as you go around, are the weight of the bricks, they're kind of supporting one another?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. And as he's building it, he's making a wooden chain, and it's going to be, again, self-supporting because, again, physics, you make essentially a hoop on the inside of it, and it's going to support it as it goes up without the need for hundreds of feet of scaffolding, which would have been impossible to do at the time.
Wow.
But it's an incredible technological achievement.
Pulled it off.
He did. He pulled it off. And he actually lived to see it finished, and he's buried there today.
Wow.
Next, let's move to St. Peter's. The centerpiece of Renaissance church architecture, Renaissance/Baroque. It's going to kind of span two styles, the Renaissance and the Baroque, is going to be St. Peter's Basilica. And we didn't talk about this when we talked about old St. Peter's, but the position of it is going to be fascinating. So again, here we have the circus where St. Peter was martyred. And then it's going to be right around here where there was a cemetery in Roman times. And again, traditionally, we believed for centuries that this is where St. Peter was buried, and it was recently uncovered. What was it, less than 20 years ago or so, less than 10 years ago, maybe. This is the actual place, sorry?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was during the pontificate of Paul VI, really, that it happened. Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Late 70s.
It was tradition for a while. This brown outline here, right? This brown outline, this is old St. Peter's. And so this is where St. Peter's was in relation to that circus and to the burial place. And then this outline here, this is the current St. Peter's. And you can see where the altar of the two are perfectly matched up. And so again, we believed it for many years that this was the place, and now we know this is the place. One other thing I do want to mention, I keep coming back to this East versus West. One argument that is constantly made by modern Catholics about the priest facing the people. Hey, that's okay, because it's done that way in St. Peter's, don't you know? And it's true. If you look at pictures of Mass being said at St. Peter's, he's quote unquote facing the people. Well, the reason is because St. Peter's is backwards. It's not facing east, it's facing west. And so when you have the altar here, the priest faces towards the east. He's not facing towards the people, he's facing east, or the Pope. I guess the Holy Father is the only one who can say Mass there. When the Holy Father's saying Mass, he's facing towards the east. And it just so happens that there's lots of people there. There's also people behind him too. So it really doesn't matter. And it's kind of a spurious argument. But I just wanted to point that out, that even the most important, arguably, church in Christendom doesn't follow the rule. And the reason is because of Vatican Hill. You can see that in the plan right behind it. Vatican Hill was right there. And so they couldn't build the church where they wanted to. They had to flip it around. So, yeah. I know around the time of the council, everybody was arguing that the priest should face people because of that circuit archaeologism. We need to go back to the primitive church and imitate what they were doing. And as you're saying, it turns out that's not what they were doing. Nope. They weren't facing the people. Nope, not in the slightest.
Yeah, fake news.
Yeah, exactly. Michelangelo, by the way, is going to be brought on to construct the dome. It's going to be the tallest dome in the world once it's complete. I just went through pretty quickly because we're running short on time. Some of the other plans that were initially thought of. Bernini's brought in. Bernini's one of the great sculptors, / architects of the Baroque period, and he's going to develop this colonnade, which is basically this huge entranceway into St. Peter's, just to get a sense of the scale. Right, here's a couple pictures to show you just how massive it is. I don't know if this is anecdotal or not, but when the Pope would have visiting dignitaries heads of state coming in, he would not allow them to come straight up to through the center part of the colonnade. He would make them go through these columns like I'm showing you here. And so you would have to come all the way in. And the reason why is because with all of these columns, you can't really see the grandeur of St. Peter's until you exit right here. And then then you see it. And then it's supposed to be kind of this big reveal of the power and the majesty of the Holy Father, which again, I don't know if that's anecdotal or if it was planned that way, but either way, it certainly made an impression on people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Baroque is all about triumphal Catholicism, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yep, absolutely. The atrium, the entrance, again, the same sort of thing. These massive bronze doors. This is the Jubilee door, which right now is open here in 2025. These are originally from Constantine's Basilica. These are original from that, and it's made from Roman bronze itself. This portico, this porch is absolutely magnificent. And there's all these little symbols of it. This current St. Peter's Basilica being kind of the child of the original St. Peter's Basilica. There's one bit of stone that's on the interior of St. Peter's Basilica that is different from all the other stone, and this is porphyry. Porphyry is a very dense, very difficult to find stone, and it's usually only found in quarries in certain parts of Egypt. It was brought over by the Romans, and this disc marks the spot where in the old St. Peter's, where where Charlemagne was crowned. So it's the only piece of porphyry other than, actually there's a piece in the baptistry, but whatever. It's the only piece. So if you're ever in St. Peter's Basilica, that you're standing on the spot where Charlemagne was crowned.
Wow, didn't know that.
The baldacchino or the baldachin, again, this huge structure, the largest bronze structure in the world, 66 feet tall, and this incredible heliacal or this twisting form. This is meant to evoke the Solomon temple, right? The Temple of Solomon, because they had the Temple of Solomon had these same pillars. It is believed that actually these pillars right here were salvaged from the Holy Land and brought in to St. Peter's. Are these the actual pillars from Solomon's temple? I don't know. Some people say they are. Some people say they don't. I'm more in the camp that they're not, because our Lord said, not one stone shall be left. I don't know, but it's one of those things that's interesting. At the very least, it's from the Holy Land and it was somewhere, but that is the design of that baldacchino. And again, just to give you a sense of the scale, there's some cleaning crew right there. It's massive. Just the huge weight of it alone must be astounding.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, is the barrel vault one of the characteristics of the Baroque? Because like when you go to Rome, it's most of the churches are Baroque, and it's like filled with Baroque churches. And I just see a lot of barrel vaults. Yeah.
It is going to be more of a barrel vault because they're not Italian. The Roman style of building, they're not going to be borrowing much from the Gothic. So there's not going to be that pointed arch. There's not going to be that ribbed vaulting. So a lot of it is going to be that kind of barrel vault like you're talking about, because they're still going to keep a lot of the same characteristics from the earlier Romanesque style, which leads us right into, again, Baroque. There's going to be a lot of drama, movement, and emotion. The current issue of the Angelus actually talks about the post-Reformation period and the Counter-Reformation. Should be arriving in your mailboxes any day if it hasn't already.
Yeah, if you're not subscribed, get your copy.
Absolutely. Go to angeluspress.org. But there's going to be drama, just a lot of drama, a lot of light and shadow. And I'd like to talk about the same church that I wrote an article about for the Angelus for this issue, which is Iliesu. This is kind of the Jesuit mother church. And so right after the Council of Trent, it's introducing this huge, vast, uninterrupted nave that's going to be funneling attention directly to the high altar. So I'm going to quote myself if that's not too narcissistic, but I've already done the work. It's just efficient, Father. Every design choice reinforced the message thundered by Trent. The Mass is the centerpiece of Catholic life. The acoustics were designed for powerful, clear preaching, reinforcing Catholic evangelization. This emphasis on unity and focus was not aesthetic, but deeply theological. The Jesuits understood that architecture was a form of catechesis. And so you're going to see art and architecture mirroring this. It's going to be all about bringing your attention both to the Mass that's going on. They're going to get rid of the rood screens. They're going to get rid of that screen between the sanctuary and the nave. They're going to allow the people to see everything, and they're going to bring catechesis to the people with all of these mosaics and all of these paintings and all of these frescoes, and it's just going to positively just explode. This isn't a huge church, but it's going to be hugely influential in the life of church architecture, because the Jesuits are going to take this as kind of the blueprint, and they're going to take it all over the world. You're going to see carbon copies almost of Il Jesu in places like here in Arizona, in the Philippines, in Spain, in everywhere that the Jesuits went. They're going to bring a copy or at least aspects of Il Jesu to the rest of the world. And so it's going to be a hugely important, again, aspect of church architecture. One little thing I want to mention, if in case you don't, people who are watching don't know, you're going to see this pulpit about halfway down. This was again common during the time because there's no microphones, there's no acoustics other than the preacher's voice, and you're going to see this little ceiling over the pulpit. Oftentimes, this is just purely meant to reflect the sound of the priest speaking back down to the people. That's why you're going to see that. There's also a symbolism of things that are sacred, meaning the priest preaching to the people should be covered, but there's also a practical reason for it as well. So you're often going to see that little ceiling above it. It's mainly for acoustics.
Yeah. Maybe you could just speak a little bit. I know we've taken up a bit of time, but this is fascinating stuff. So, maybe you just speak a little bit about how the Baroque was really an expression of the faith in the face of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, I think of Kenneth Clark's famous Civilization series, and he as a Protestant pointed that out, that the Protestants were so iconoclastic, and the church really wanted to take things the Protestants were denying and saying, no, guess what? We believe this, and we're Catholic, and so we're going to really ramp up the Catholic bling in order to assert our faith.
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be a second, third, depending on how you look at it, iconoclasm that's going to happen, right? The Catholic churches that are going to be overtaken by the Protestants, they're going to have all of the sculpture, all of the decoration, all of the frescoes, everything ripped out of it, all the mosaics taken away, because in Protestant theology, they don't believe in praying to the saints. They don't believe in veneration. It's the personal relationship, right? And so the focus in Protestant churches is going in and having that relationship with God. How do you have that? Through the preaching. The preaching is going to be the main focus. Whereas in the Baroque churches, the council and the Jesuits especially, and the rest of the church, they're going to say, no, you guys are dead wrong. You're going to strip those things out of our churches. We're going to put more in. We're going to do more emphasis on the supernatural, on the lives of the saints, on the theological mysteries. So there's going to be this explosion in Catholic art to reinforce this idea that, hey, this is not bad. Don't shy away from images. Don't shy away from decoration and beautiful things. We are not these people who are meant to be austere our entire lives or through the entire liturgical season. In any case, we are meant to rejoice in the glory of God, and we can reflect that with the beauty of architecture and art.
Yeah. Even with relics as well, just putting relics front and center. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think of the
making sure that the
flamboyant
tabernacle is there as well.
Right. Yeah, then the flamboyant statues, just sort of like the humanness of it. Like the Protestantism was kind of saying that human nature is completely destroyed by sin, whereas the Baroque is using the human as the lift up to the divine. It's not, as you say, it wasn't ashamed of the human or as suppressing the human.
Absolutely. All right, so let's keep going. We've seen a lot of innovation. Now we're going to see kind of a return with neoclassicism. There's always going to be kind of this cyclical nature of architecture and art. We're going to do innovation and then we're going to go back. We're going to do innovation and then we're going to go back. And this is, excuse me, this neoclassical period in the 18th and 19th century is when we're going to see kind of a reaction against what a lot of people, including within the church, saw as the excesses of Baroque. Too much gold, too much statuary. Like, okay, I get that you guys want to put in all of these things and that's great, but too much. So let's pare it back a little bit. And what are they going to go back to? Classical periods. So the Roman and the Greek periods as well. So this is St. Isaac Cathedral. That's in St. Petersburg. And they're going to go back to, again, more of that pared down. There's still going to be some decoration and some beauty to it. But again, it's anything in culture is kind of like a pendulum, right? You're going to see that pendulum going back and forth. A return to simplicity, a return to clean lines. This is one of the hallmarks of the neoclassical movement. This is a church called La Madeleine in Paris, modeled after a Roman temple. And a lot of people are like, well, that looks very pagan. And in fact, actually, it was meant to be. It was originally meant to be a monument to one of Napoleon's son. I'm a little hazy on that one. And then shortly thereafterwards, it became a Catholic church, and it is glorious on the inside. It's absolutely beautiful, but from the outside, it absolutely does look like a pagan temple. There's not going to be a lot of Catholic churches that are going to be built with this style. There are going to be some, and there's going to be this interesting period, especially in the United States and in Western Europe, where we're going to see kind of an influx of Byzantine revival along with classical revival, and the two are going to mix, and it's going to make this really interesting amalgamation of Byzantine, classical, modern. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's regardless, it's a really interesting kind of aspect of church architecture in this period. If you're not into classical, that's fine. We got another revival for you. This Gothic revival, this is going to be brought about mostly by the Protestants. I wrote an article in the Angelus some years ago about Gothic revival as well. And Protestants, they mostly took over Catholic churches like we were talking about. But when it came time to build their own, they were like, well, what style should we do it in? Well, definitely not Baroque, not Renaissance, Gothic. I think things were good in Gothic, so let's go back to that. So the Protestants are actually going to be one of the driving forces behind this Gothic revival, but Catholics are going to hop on the bandwagon too. St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York City in the States, this is going to be an example of Gothic revival. It's going to be built according to those Gothic standards. Houses of Parliament, by the way, all of that stuff, that's all Gothic revival. In Montreal, the beautiful basilica of Our Lady of Notre Dame in Montreal, this is Gothic revival, one of the most beautiful churches I've ever been in. This is grand, this is beautiful, but there's also going to be a simplicity to it as well. When we think of childhood, like drawing a little church in a prairie, right? This is Gothic revival. It's going to be sweeping America, especially in the plain states. There's going to be a lot of Protestant influence, but there's going to be some Catholic churches popping up in these plain states as well. I'm thinking Minnesota, the Dakotas, etc. And a lot of churches in the United States are going to be built according to this Gothic revival style. One church that you may be familiar with is the Old Immaculata. Again, this was built in the late 1800s in St. Mary's in Kansas. A lot of churches, again, especially throughout the Midwest, are going to be built in this Gothic revival style. You go through small towns all throughout. This is a tiny little town called Flush, Kansas. You wouldn't know it existed if you didn't drive through it. Gothic revival there as well. So there's this sense of kind of going back to our roots. Settlers in the West, they had an abundance of stone. They knew how to build. They were very well informed about how physics worked, and they're going to build according to this style. So that's going to be this influx of church architecture in the United States, especially in smaller parishes.
Do they call that Prairie Gothic?
Prairie Gothic, yep. Or Country Gothic, or sometimes Pioneer Gothic. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
No, you see those churches everywhere.
Yeah.
We go up to North Dakota. I mean, Father May goes up North Dakota here, and it's just like driving around Bismarck, Mandan, you see these types of churches everywhere.
And you're even going to see some Gothic revival in houses as well. That famous painting, American Gothic, right? That house behind it with the pointed windows, that's a Gothic revival house. So it's going to be all throughout the settlement period. Okay. Yeah. So now we get to your favorite period, Father, which is modernism and contemporary trends.
Beautiful.
Isn't it? And this has already been happening in the early 20th century, this kind of trying to match what's happening in the rest of modern architecture. But Vatican II is really going to solidify it. Of course, it always goes back to Vatican II, right? But it is happening a little bit beforehand. But Vatican II is going to put the stamp on it and say, hey, let's shift from grandiose styles to simplified functional spaces. Let's not worry too much about making it so grandiose. Let's just make it functional, make it work. Again, it's the people and their connection with God. It's sort of that Protestant mentality. This is a church in Japan. There's also going to be a greater emphasis on congregational participation. This is in Seattle. Congregational participation, again, less of that. There's no more sanctuary. There's no more communion rail. People are going to be right up in the face of the priest, and the priest is facing the people, etc. There's also going to be this focus on circular or semicircular layouts instead of that traditional long nave. Again, the people being the most important part, quote unquote, of the church, of the mass service. And so this is going to be this trend that's going to be overtaking. And again, Vatican II is not really going to cause it, but it's going to baptize it. Modernism, is going to be sweeping the United States during this time, not the heresy, but modernist architecture. There's going to be, this trend towards getting away anything that's extraneous, anything that's unnecessary. And there's going to be this architect, the Swiss architect named Le Corbusier, who's going to say, let's get rid of anything that's not efficient. And he's going to eventually be the grandfather of what's called the industrial style, or the international style. It's called by different names. International style. It's these glass and iron and steel, right, constructions. Everything is just efficient. And you're going to see some of it trickle down into houses, and then you're going to see some of it trickle down into churches as well. This is a church in Oceanside, California. There's no unnecessary decoration. There's hard geometric angles. Less is more. Let's just make it efficient. Let's make it work. And it's minimal designs. And it's all going to be focused on space and light. This is the interior of that same church. And so it's stripping away anything that's extraneous, anything that's unnecessary. And we see echoes of that Protestant iconoclastic period happening all over again when we look at modern Catholic architecture. Like I mentioned last week, one of the big downfalls of Catholic religious art in the 20th century is that Catholic religious art almost had kind of an inferiority complex. We're always chasing after, hey, let's try to make Catholic art that's kind of like Picasso, like abstract expressionism, that's like, something like this. And architects are going to fall into the same trap over and over again. There's going to be this movement that's going to be coming about in the 1950s called brutalism, which is, if you see these big, ugly looking concrete buildings, that's a brutalist style. And this is a style that's come about by just by pouring concrete. And it's very purpose built. There's not, no extra decoration, but it is striving to be what it appears to be made of. That's kind of the whole point of it. We're going to make things out of concrete, and you're going to know that it's made out of concrete. We're not going to put any facades. We're not going to put any decoration. It just is what it is. It's kind of a reaction against the early modernists. Brutalism is all about excitement, new technology. Let's bring this in. But like I said, it just doesn't work for churches. It just doesn't work. This is Le Corbusier, one of his most famous buildings. This is the church in France. I don't have the name of it here. Why do I not have the name of it? Oh, there it is, Ronchamp Chapel. Sorry. But again, it's like he's chasing after the trend, and he's the one who started the trend, but it just doesn't work. It's not going to work for church architecture. I think anyone with a mind and a sense of beauty can see that. Fast forward to modern times today. What are the big trends in church architecture? I was browsing a bunch of architecture firms that specialize in Catholic architecture. Big buzzwords that I saw was sustainability, green architecture, solar panels, eco-friendly materials. Also, they're going to try to do a hybrid of tradition and innovation. They're also going to try to bring in things like multimedia. It looks like a concert. It doesn't look like a church. Certainly doesn't look like a Catholic church. I saw this one style that was referenced as extraterrestrial style. So, hey, let's try to even go outside of humanism and let's go up to the stars. There's this wonderful quote, and I referenced it at the very beginning of this episode from The Beautiful Home. Buildings designed for persons without souls are different than buildings designed for persons with souls. The soul has different requirements than the body. The soul wants beauty, goodness, truth, and eternal life. The body wants some convenience, food, and an easy death. Architects who design for the souled are classives. Architects who design for the soulless are progressive. Progressive architects conflate newness with change. Classives know that when the new is the new is in development with tradition. And so, what are we going to see in the future? What's the future of church architecture and design? Hopefully, it's a return to tradition. And by that I mean, I don't mean let's just carbon copy. Let's just do Romanesque styles. Let's just, hey, that's a great church back in Europe. Let's just copy that. No, I really think that there's space for us to innovate, to do new things without making them ugly, without making them just look awful. There's some slides up on the screen of new churches. I think this one is in Knoxville, Tennessee. A beautiful, beautiful new church that was done for the diocese there in a really striking, beautiful, kind of neoclassical, kind of Romanesque style. But again, there's room for us to be experimental and innovative at the same time, retain the beauty. There's a recent poll that only 10% of congregants say that they prefer churches in the round. But architects love it. They love to build churches in the round. But actual Catholics who are polled, they only 10% like it. In another survey, 73% of congregants, and again, this is all Catholics, not just traditional Catholics, 73% of congregants say that traditionalism is important in church design, and 89% admitted that church design strongly affects their experience of the Mass. So if Vatican II invited the architectural profession to contribute to its own voice to the liturgy, for the most part, again, I'm quoting from this same blog post, for the most part, congregations would like modern architects to just shut up. I love that. But again, let's come back to the Immaculata. There's space for us to do really beautiful, incredible things without compromising innovation, experimentation, but we can make things still be beautiful at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the pattern we've seen throughout this history, this whirlwind history that you've done such a great job on, is that the church architecture is a reflection of the belief of those who are constructing the buildings. And I mean, one thing that's just so obvious with the new churches is that they go hand in glove with the new Mass.
Yes.
That if you have the traditional Mass, it demands like Romanesque or Gothic or Baroque type architecture if God is there, and we have this supreme act of worship. But those new churches, they're just so flat. They're so democratic, They're so, I don't know, banal. And let's just face it, the new Mass really lines up with them. they go hand in glove. Yeah.
I think the thing is, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think that there are ways that we can innovate totally brand new styles like previous generations have done with Gothic and Baroque, et cetera.
Yeah.
But here's the difference. The architects, the builders, the stonemasons, et cetera, back then, they were building a new style in service of the Mass, in service of God, in service of the church. Whereas now these new styles, they're made for man, and then we're just kind of making them work for a church, and they don't work for a church. It's not going to work. I think in the future, we can innovate and we can make new designs and totally new styles, whatever it's going to be called in 300 years, I don't know. But as long as we do it for God and for the Mass and to reflect the theology, then it will be beautiful and it will be great. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm excited to hopefully look down from heaven and see what it is.
Well, I mean, you think about the technology that we have today, the leaps and bounds we've advanced in technology, and surely that technology can be mobilized to build a new architectural style. Yeah. But the thing is, you have to have the faith, right?
Yes.
And you have to have, I mean, to build these types of structures, you really need a community, right? Mm-hmm. And I hope that one day we will have the supernatural faith along with the technology, and that there's going to be a happy marriage between the two to build a structure that complements the traditional Mass in the same way these old architectural styles have.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I think that's very well said.
Yeah. All right, Andrew. Well, I think you've just kind of shown up all the priests with with the slideshow and on the diagrams that you've drawn for us. So
it's just because I'm a nerd, Father. That's it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing this knowledge with us. I really enjoyed this hour and a half we've had together, and appreciate your time.
All right. Talk with you next time. Thanks, Father.
Okay.
Thank you.